Okay, so hello and welcome back. Now in this video we will talk about basically the concept of division. And so we have something like a story here, and here essentially there are two boys over here. They have some gulab jamuns. Essentially gulab jamun is some kind of sweet that you can find in India, but essentially you can think of that as any object that you want to essentially divide between two people. And the first boy over here says, wow, gulab jamuns, I wish I could eat all of them. And the first one says, please no, I also want some, let us share them equally. So they want to share these equally, essentially, meaning the same number of gulab jamuns are supposed to get to each and every one of them. So then, but essentially how they don't know how to divide them, so they will decide to essentially share one by one, meaning that they do not know in advance how many they're going to get each. So essentially what they will do, essentially one of the gulab jamuns goes to the first one, the second, essentially another one goes to the second one, and there is some left over here. So one goes over here, one goes over here, some are left over here. And then again they will do the same thing. Another one goes to the first boy, another one goes to the second boy, and then some basically remain here, right? Again, basically another one goes to the first boy, another one goes to the second boy, and still two are remaining here. And in the last step, essentially, these two are also from these two, one goes to the first boy, and the other one goes to the second boy, and none is left over here. So now, essentially, four gulab jamuns are over here, and 4 gulab jamuns are over here, and 0 are over here. When you're left with the 0, that means that essentially the division is completed, right? And we started with essentially 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 gulab jamuns, and then each has gotten now essentially 4 gulab jamuns. So 2 times 4 is equal to 8, which is the number that we started with, right? Now let's see essentially what happened here. In this step over here, what we had is that basically in this step what happened was that essentially 2 of the gulab jamuns were essentially distributed among those 2 people, each for essentially 1 person. So that means that we started with, and the total number of gulab jamuns that we started with over here was 8, right? So essentially we had basically 8 gulab jamuns. We had these 8 gulab jamuns, and we took away 2 of them, and then we were left with 6 of them over here. Then in this step, essentially the 6 gulab jamuns that were here, we took away again 2 of them, and what remains is essentially a 4. So 4 gulab jamuns remain here, and then from the 4 gulab jamuns that we had over here, from the 4 sweets, we took away again 2 of them, and then what remains is a 2, which is essentially these 2 over here. And then again from these 2, you take away the 2, and then you distribute it among these people, and you get the 0, and then each essentially gets basically 4 gulab jamuns, right? So that's basically one way that you can divide basically a certain number of objects among essentially a number of people, basically, or essentially among some groups. Next, we have another example. So we want to complete Ritu's art and craft project by drawing 12 bindis. Bindis are essentially these dots, equally on 2 ice cream cones as cherries. So what I can do is that, again, it's the same type of situation, meaning that we don't, I mean, in the previous situation, there were 2 boys, and essentially the two boys didn't know how many sweets they're going to get each, so they started essentially dividing equally one by one, and once they got to the last step of the division, then they knew that each essentially has gotten essentially 4 sweets basically. And here again we have the same situation. Here essentially we have a number of these bindis, and we have essentially and essentially we know that essentially we have 2 groups, right? And then we want to divide these equally between these 2 groups, and we do not know how many of these bindis each of the groups is going to get, right? So I give essentially 2 of them to essentially, or I give essentially 2 of these to essentially to the 2 ice creams. So one for here, another one for here. Right? Then again I give basically in the second round I give this one to this one, and this one to this one. In the third round I give this one to this one, and this one to this one. In the fourth round I'm going to give this one to this one, and this one to this one. In the next round I'm going to give this one to this one, and this one to this one. And in the last round I'm going to give this one to this one, and this one to this one. So now basically I have essentially 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 for this group. So I have 6 bindis here, and I have 6 bindis here, right? So that means that essentially I could write essentially the number of bindis that we started with was a 12. So we have divided essentially 12 divided by, we can write it this way, or you can also write it this way, 12 divided by 2, or essentially 12 divided by 2. Both mean the same thing, right? And that is equal to 6, right? And this is also, of course, the same thing, equal to 6. Now again, what happened here was the same story, meaning that I had these 12 bindis, and in the first round, well, I didn't know how many essentially each ice cream would get in the end, but then I got away 2 of them, and I was left with 10 of them. Then from the 10 again I took away 2 of them, and I was left with essentially 8 bindis. From the 8 bindis I got away 2 of them, I was left with 6 bindis. From the 6 bindis I got away 2 of them, and I was left with basically 4 bindis. From the 4 I got away 2 of them, I was left with 2, and from the 2 I got away 2, and I was left with a 0. And when I get to 0, that means that essentially then there is no bindis to continue with, which means that I'm at the end of the operation, right? So now it's also interesting to note how many basically how many steps I've gone through until I got to essentially a 0, and that's essentially 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 steps, right? That's 6 steps, and that's exactly the number of bindis that each of these got. So we had essentially 12 bindis. The first ice cream got 6 bindis, and the second ice cream got 6 bindis. And we went through exactly essentially 6 steps in our subtraction. And you also note that essentially that division is essentially nothing but repeated subtraction, meaning that I'm subtracting essentially a constant number. The number doesn't change, so it's a constant number. I'm subtracting a constant number from these objects over and over again until I'm at the end of the operation. So that's basically what happened here. Now in the previous operation, we still had the exact same situation, meaning that I had 8 of these gulab jamuns, and we had essentially these two people, among which the gulab jamuns were supposed to be distributed, right? So then I started with the first round where I gave away 2 of them, so 8 minus 2 is equal to 6. And then in the second round again I took away essentially 2 of them, so then 6 minus 2 is equal to 4, and then 4 minus 2 is equal to 2, and then 2 minus 2 is equal to 0. So in 4 steps I got to essentially 0, which means that essentially the operation was completed in 4 steps. And we saw over here that basically each of the boys got essentially 4 sweets, right? So 4 sweets and 4 steps over here, and the constant number essentially goes with essentially the number of groups that we have, and the number that you start with over here is essentially the total number of objects that I had in the beginning, right? So that's basically the first 2 examples that we had over here, right? Now let's take a look at the next example. Now in this example, what we have essentially we have essentially again a number of objects, so that's essentially 7 sweets, and that's essentially 5 sweets. So and you know that essentially 7 plus 5 is equal to 12, so we have 12 sweets in total. And we want to, and these are called laddus. Laddu is this kind of sweet in India. Now these laddus, we want to equally divide them in 3 plates. So we have 1, 2, and 3 plates over here. All of these sweets together have to be distributed here equally, right? So again, basically it's the same kind of situation, meaning that we have a certain number of objects that we want to distribute, and the number of groups among which those objects are supposed to be distributed, the number of those groups is already known, and we do not know in advance how many essentially sweets each group is going to get. So we have to essentially keep distributing essentially one by one until we get to the end of the operation. So I give essentially 1 to this plate, another 1 to this plate, another 1 to this plate, and then I will give essentially this 1 to this plate, this 1 to this plate, and then this 1 to this plate, and then I will give basically this 1 to this plate, this 1 to this plate, this 1 to this plate, and then I will give essentially this 1 to this plate, this 1 to this plate, and this 1 to this plate. And you see that each plate gets basically 4 sweets. So I have 4 sweets here, 4 sweets here, 4 sweets here, and I had 12 sweets over here, right? So that's again the same type of situation. I had 12 sweets. I took away 3 of them in the first round, and I was left with 9 sweets. From the 9 sweets, again I took away essentially 3 of them, and I was left with 6 sweets. From the 6 suites, we took away essentially 3 of them. We were left with 3, and from the 3 we took away 3, and essentially we got to 0, which is the end of the operation. Now here again we went through essentially 4 steps, and which essentially goes with the number of essentially with the number of objects that each group got. And the numbers over here that you're subtracting 3, 3, 3, then this number is constant, and that essentially refers to the number of groups that we had, right? And that's essentially basically it, right? Now let's take a look at another situation that we have. Now in this situation is a little bit different. Now let me clean this up. Now this situation is a little bit different, meaning that I have these star-shaped beads over here, and there is 20 of them over here. So that's essentially 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus, so that's 20 beads over here. And Garima wants to make essentially bracelets. So she wants essentially to make essentially these bracelets over here, and each bracelet is going to get basically 5 stars, meaning that essentially with a fewer number of stars, the bracelet is not going to be complete. So we need essentially 5 stars. So what she does is that she takes away essentially 5 of the stars, and she makes 1 bracelet. So now 5 of the stars are gone, and which means that essentially 20 minus 5 is equal to 15, which is the number of stars that we have over here. And we have one bracelet. Then basically what she does is that from the 15 stars, she takes away 5 again, and now we have essentially 10 stars over here and 2 bracelets. Again, she takes away from this 10, she takes away basically 5 stars, and we have 5 stars left over here, and we have 3 bracelets. And then in the end, essentially she takes away essentially from the 5 stars, she takes away 5 of them, she's left with 0 stars, and then we have now 1, 2, 3, and 4 bracelets over here, right? Now this is a little bit different from the previous situations, because of the fact that essentially now we don't know how many groups we are going to have. We know essentially the total number of objects that we want to distribute. We already know that. We know that essentially we have 20 stars over here. That's the total number of objects that we want to distribute. But we don't know how many groups we are going to have, meaning that in the previous example, essentially what we did, we had essentially some number of, for example, 20 objects over here, and then we knew that essentially we wanted to distribute them among 1, 2, and 3 groups, right? We did know about the number of groups, but then we didn't know how many essentially objects each group was going to get, right? But then over here we do not know the number of groups, but we know the number of objects that each group is going to get, because we know that essentially each bracelet essentially needs 5 beads, right? So then if I write down the operation related to this example, we had essentially 20 objects there, and we took away 5 of them, and then we were left with 15 objects. Then from the 15 objects again we took away 5 of them, and then we were left with 10. from the 10 we took away 5 of them and we were left with 5, and from 5 if you take away 5 we are left with 0, which means that this is essentially the end of the operation. And we went through 4 steps over here, right? So now here essentially the constant number that you repeatedly subtract from this number refers essentially to the number of objects that each group is going to get. So essentially each group is going to get essentially 5 objects, and that's basically this 5 over here that you have. And essentially the number of steps that you go through until you get to 0, it just simply refers to the number of basically to the number of groups that we are going to have, right? So this is now the number of groups, and this 5 over here is the number of objects in each group. Okay, so that and of course in the previous examples we had essentially the opposite of this situation. In the previous examples, essentially this constant number that we were subtracting essentially gave us the this number essentially gave us the, for example, if you take a look over here, we had basically 8 gulab jamuns, right? And basically we were subtracting essentially 8 minus 2, and then 6 minus 2, and 4 minus 2, and 2 minus 2. So the 2 that we were, the constant number that we were subtracting referred to the number of groups basically. But then over here essentially then the constant number refers to the number of objects, meaning essentially the total number of basically objects that each group is going to get. So it's kind of the opposite of the previous situation. Now let's take a look at the next example here, and you could have essentially either one of these situations, meaning that essentially there is always this thing going on, that you have essentially some number that you start with, which is always essentially the total number of objects available to you that is supposed to be distributed among a number of groups essentially, right? And then you take away essentially from some number from that, and then you will have some sum, and then 15 again minus 5 is equal to 10, and then 10 minus 5 is equal to 5, and then 5 minus 5 is equal to 0. And there is this repeated subtraction is always going to be there. The only thing, and here essentially you go, for example, through 4 steps, right? So the important things here is this number that you start with, this constant number that you keep subtracting, and this number of steps, right? Depending on the situation, and essentially you have essentially 2 things here. You have essentially the number of basically the number of groups, and you also have the number of objects each group gets, right? So you have these 2 things essentially essentially in any division. You have a number of groups, meaning that, for example, you have 2 plates or 3 plates or 4 plates. That's essentially your number of groups. and then in each plate you end up having, for example, 4 suites or 3 suites or 5 suites. That's the number of objects that each group gets. So sometimes essentially this constant number is going to be the first one, sometimes it's going to be the second one, and then again, depending on this, then basically then the number of steps that you go through is going to be sometimes essentially the number of objects, the number of groups, or the number of objects, basically, right? Now let's take a look at the next example here. So that's that. Now here again we have the exact same situation as the previous one. So here essentially what we have, we want to make these strings, and these as essentially each string is going to get essentially 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 basically beats, right? So which means that essentially now again we know that essentially each group is going to get 7 beats, and we don't know how many groups we are going to get in the end. So then I'm going to say that basically I'm going to essentially, and I have essentially 1, 2, 3, 4, 7 times 3, I have 21 beats over here. So since I know that essentially each string does need 7 basically beats, I take away 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, and I give it to the first string. Then I will essentially take away for the second string, I will take away 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Then for the third string, I will take away 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So that means that 1, 2, and I'm going to end up with 3 strings basically. This is the second string, and this is the third string. So I will have 3 strings in total. And so what I did here was that I had 21 basically beats, and I took away 7 of them for the first string, and I was left with basically 21 minus 7 is the same as 20 minus 6, which is a 14, right? And a 14 again, I take away 7 of them for the second string, and I'm left with a 7. And from the 7, I take away essentially 7 for the third string. I'm left with 0. So now here, basically this constant number 7 that I keep subtracting, that refers to essentially to the number of objects in each group. And over here we go through essentially 3 steps. Over here essentially we go through 3 steps, and the 3 steps now refer to the number of groups that we ended up having essentially, right? Now let's take a look at these. Now before we move to the next examples, I'm going to end this video here, and we will continue with the next video. I mean, with the rest of these examples. We will do them in the next video. Thank you.